Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jane Wales.
I wanted to say a word before introducing this panel tonight. You know, in Silicon Valley, you come to believe that everything started in a garage. In the case of the Global Philanthropy Forum, it started in a living room. It was John Morgridge's living room back in 2001 when we decided, a group of us, that the moment had come to try to do what we could to expand philanthropy and help improve it along the way. One of the people in that living room was a young woman named Juliette Gimond. And Juliette is a member of the Hewlett family and was a remarkable person who deeply believed in philanthropy and social change. And Juliette came and joined us in my office and was the first, I think she was called Director of Outreach or something of the sort. But the point is that Juliette was a woman of fierce determination. If you knew Juliette, you became a member of the Global Philanthropy Forum, or else she was a tough cookie with a huge, huge heart. And this past year, she died way, way too young of pancreatic cancer. I've always believed that you don't really die until people actually forget you. And I know that none of us who knew Juliette would forget her. So I invite you all to remember her with me, just with a quick moment of silence. She would be really grateful to see you here. So thank you for being here. Tonight we get to talk a little bit about technology, the other thing we talk about a lot in Silicon Valley. But we're going to talk not only about all the extraordinary things it does, it can do for us, everything from remote sensing to blockchain, to artificial intelligence, to CRISPR, to gene editing. And as we think about it, I think Paula Goldman is going to help us think through the various ways that these extraordinary technologies can be put to the social good. But something for us to remember is also the whole issue of whether we will be wise enough to put these capabilities to ethical use. So while we are surely very grateful to technologists for creating these tools for us, it's up to all of us to establish the norms for their ethical use. So it's another example of there being, as we say, no bystanders. Paula Goldman of Omidyar Network is going to lead this panel. Let me look up your new title, because it's a relatively new, or new to me, title for Paula. She's Vice President and founding head of the Technology and Society Solutions Lab at Omidyar Network. She's an extraordinary woman, and she's going to come and lead this conversation and introduce her exceptional panel. So, Paula.
Thank you, Jane. I think we have a treat in store tonight, and a rich and complicated and inspiring and infuriating topic all at once. So the title of this panel is Technology and the Values That Guide. It could not come at a more opportune time. We are at a pivotal moment in which society is wrestling anew with its relationship with technology. And I think, you know, there's a number of things that we've collectively woken up to in the last few years, but the question of technology's role in our lives is front and center. And the headlines that we're seeing today are the tip of the iceberg, right? So you can look at headlines about the Cambridge Analytica scandal or self-driving cars and fatalities, but there are much, much broader questions in which the code that guides how these technologies are being driven is being written now, and the values that are behind it are up for grabs. If in the last few decades it was okay to assume that technology was going to change the world for good, and it has. There are so many amazing ways in which it has, and it continues to. It is now also incumbent upon us to ask, what are the risks and the ways in which this can go wrong? And what are the trade-offs? And how will we as a society collectively adjudicate those trade-offs to make sure that we're maximizing the good in the world? So I want to just get quickly into this discussion, but a few words about the panelists before we do. Sitting right to my left there, Tamika Tillman, who's the co-founder and director of the Blockchain Trust Accelerator, New America, and also a speechwriter and senior advisor to the last 2 secretaries of state. Then to his left, Varun Gori, senior economist at the World Bank in development economics, where he co-leads a mind behavior unit using behavioral science to make development programs and the delivery of technology more effective. Then we have Anne Hale-Milaresi, the CEO of Radiant Earth, also an investee of Omidyar Network, a company that creates geospatial analytics using imagery and mapping data to help solve challenges in the developing world. And then finally, last but not least, Simon Segars, the CEO of ARM, a British multinational semiconductor and software design company, which has been called the world's most influential intellectual property design company. He also sits on the boards of, amongst organizations, SoftBank, Global Semiconductor Alliance, and Dolby Labs. So we have short of an hour for this conversation, and I think we should dive in on a sort of positive, inspiring note, because all of these folks are, they're working on technologies ranging from blockchain to AI to geospatial tech, and much more that have just tremendous potential. So I thought we'd sort of start with that, and start with what is it that gives you hope as you think about these technologies and sort of drives you to work on that. So maybe Tamika, let's start with you.
Blockchain is a great place to dig in on this. And at its core, it is a technology that builds efficiency and trust. I'll give you 3 sets of numbers that help me define this in my own mind. The first is when we think about grant making. If you look at numbers from the United Nations, their estimates are that about 30% of all of the resources that are deployed in frontier market environments are lost to malfeasance, and another 15% are lost to reporting and monitoring and evaluation. So that means that before we even get out of the gate, 45 cents out of every dollar are being diverted to uses that really don't help us move the mission forward. Next set of numbers that I would focus on is from the U.S. government. Last year, the Treasury, and we talked to them a lot, made $144 billion in improper payments. That's billion with a B, which even by the standards of Washington is a lot of money. And the reason that this is happening is because their systems aren't talking to each other. The last number that I will cite is $3.5 trillion, which is the estimate of the amount that is lost to corruption worldwide each year. Blockchain has the potential to dramatically reduce each of these negative numbers, and in doing so, free up potentially trillions of dollars in capital that can be diverted to help us solve challenges around the world.
And that's what you're working on. So give us an example of the kind of project that you're engaged in right now.
So a few examples from the work we're doing at the Blockchain Trust Accelerator. We just launched a new partnership with Coca-Cola and the State Department to combat forced labor in Coca-Cola's supply chain. The challenge they face is that in too many instances, they'll have a company that will recruit workers from Nepal or Bangladesh to go and work in Dubai or Abu Dhabi. And they will be offered very favorable terms when they are recruited in Nepal or Bangladesh, and offered a very different set of terms when they land on the ground in Dubai or Abu Dhabi. And their passport is confiscated, and there's no way for them to validate the original terms of the agreement. Blockchain can create a secure digital notarized record of the agreement that they signed up to, and in doing so help reduce the prevalence of forced labor.
And for anyone in the audience who has heard blockchain a million times. And by the way, I wish I had $1. I would be like as rich as the Bitcoin billionaires if I had $1 for every time I've heard blockchain in the last 3 months. But just explain, what is blockchain?
At its core, blockchain is a record, and records are obviously nothing new. Humanity's been using records for about 5,500 years. But blockchain combines two attributes that we've never been able to put together before. The first is that it's distributed, so it is a record that is held simultaneously, in the case of public blockchains, on thousands of computers around the world. Those computers are constantly checking each other to ensure that only information that should be entered into the record is entered into the record, and they also maintain the integrity of the record. The second piece of blockchain, which is important for us to keep in mind, is that it is permanent. So once information is put into the blockchain, it can be updated, but it can never be erased. And so if you're trying to design a system to promote transparency, efficiency, and accountability, this is more powerful than anything humanity has come up with to date, and it has a very long list of potential applications in many sectors.
And I might say also trust. Let's come back to that. And let's skip to you now. So you're using a variety of really interesting geospatial technologies, and the analytics around that alone are fascinating. Give us an example or two of the applications that you're working on.
Sure. So at Radiant Earth, we work with cloud computing and now just starting with blockchain and with providers of space-based imagery, aircraft imagery, and now drone imagery. And there's a real revolution going on in the space-based imagery sector. It's called New Space, and it was founded 20 miles north of here to 20 miles south of here. And it's been a huge disruption in what has traditionally been the Earth observation market. Now, every day, commercial companies image the Earth. Every square inch of the Earth is imaged every day. Government civil satellites, most of that data is free and open, image the Earth about every 3.5 to 4 days. So we're awash in data. But the problem is it's very difficult to find and use that data for your given project. At Radiant Earth, we're focused on aggregating all of the world's open imagery as well as working with the commercial providers to bring that technology to the global development and humanitarian community. One, I think, good example is a project we're actually doing for the Gates Foundation in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals of sanitation. It's not very sexy, but it is pretty cool. And that is that they are operating many waste treatment facilities in Senegal. And they actually pay those operators to operate the facilities, but they have no independent records of what's actually getting treated in that facility. And we're monitoring 3 of their facilities from space using Earth observation visual imagery as well as radar imagery to monitor those sites every day and correlate that data with what the operator says and what they're billing and looking for correlations. And in fact, it's working. So we can provide that level of oversight and correlation. We're also doing work on illegal forestry, on transparency and journalism. So there, geography, everything happens in a place. And geography is often the fundamental denominator in many of society's most difficult problems. And now that the Earth is being imaged absolutely every day, I believe that we should be able to help the humanitarian and global development community put those technologies to work for these problems, much like the commercial sector is putting this technology to work for the futures market, because that is what's driving the innovation in the Earth observation market. And I think we have many of the same issues, and we can deal with them in the same way.
Fascinating. And there was an example when we talked. There was an example about there was one case that you used with malaria bed nets and Catholic Relief Services. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So over the past couple of years, I've spent a lot of time dealing with the largest philanthropic organizations around the globe and their investments in geospatial data and technology. And I was aware of a program in Nigeria to map all of Nigeria, every building, and estimate populations. And that work is being done for the Gates Foundation for their polio program. And I had started a conversation with Catholic Relief Services, and they had received a contract to distribute 30 million bed nets in Nigeria in 3 states. And they wanted to work with Radiant to use remote sensing to identify where all of those communities were and what the ingress and egress was so that they could, deliver the bed nets in an appropriate way. And they were, willing to sign on to a significant project. And I said, you know what? That's great, but you don't need to do that, and you'll have the data tomorrow. Because the Gates Foundation had mapped all of Nigeria, all of the roads, all of the waterways, all of the political boundaries, and all of the buildings, and then estimated all of the population and the segmentation of that population, we were able to deliver that data within 24 hours to Catholic Relief Services, and they were able to run their BedNet distribution program more efficiently, much faster, with better outcomes. That data is all public and open, but it's a stranded asset because people can't find it. And cloud computing and metadata and registries and machine learning allows us to do that type of work. I believe that this community can benefit as much as the futures market from machine learning, from Earth observations, from blockchain, if we just coalesce and build the facility to do that.
And Simon, I mean, your work sits at the intersection of a lot of these technologies, and the technologies that you license creates the backbones for so many different innovations. Talk a little bit from your perch about the promise that you're seeing and some of the programs that you yourself have created in this vein.
Yeah, I mean, some of the examples that have been discussed here kind of rely on tiny devices getting more and more intelligent, the ability to gather data, process it locally, move it into the cloud, take data from different sources and put them together to gain insight. I mean, that as an overall trend is driving a lot of our business. You asked at the beginning, what's driving change? For me, it's the accessibility of technology. And the increase or decreasing cost of technology and access to technology, and the more and more people who are getting access to technology, means that people can experiment in ways that they never could before. You don't have to have a manufacturing facility to build one thing. You can buy, very low-cost development boards. You can get access to as much compute resources you want in the cloud, and that enables innovation from people. So, what we're all about is enabling the intelligence in all these devices and trying to liberate as much innovation as we possibly can through the partnerships we develop. Specifically around the global goals that you mentioned, Anne, we had a kind of penny drop moment a few years ago that actually this technology, this embedded intelligence, this everything being networked, creates an opportunity to address all of the global goals. And we've been working with our partners to try and raise awareness of that and get people thinking that, okay, that doing that is doing good for the world, but actually there's a real business case behind it. Whether it's about deploying sensors in remote parts of developing economies, it's the same technology that people can use in the developed world. So we're really trying to raise awareness. We launched a program called 2030 Vision, where we're specifically trying to bring our partners in to get focused on addressing the global goals. And that's one example.
And I want to come back to that, but before I do, Varun, you also sit at a pretty unique perch where my understanding is that you're dealing with lots of different technologies as they're being deployed in emerging markets, and you're thinking about how behavioral science interventions might make their delivery more effective. So from that perch, how do you see the promise of tech?
Yeah, so our goal is to use behavioral science to make development projects and programs more effective. Not all our projects use technology, but when we do, we use them in 2 ways. The first is to add cognitive bandwidth to people whose lives are stressed and difficult. The second is to use technology as a platform to deliver behaviorally informed messages like reminders, social norms, social comparisons, cues to new mental models that can help people save more, stay in school, make better health choices, start new businesses. So on a couple of words about each. On the first one, adding cognitive bandwidth, the background is some compelling recent research that shows that we need to think about poverty differently. We typically think that if someone's poor, it's an access problem. They don't have access to resources or to schools or health, and that's true. However, we also know now that poverty is a decision-making context. When you're poor, you tunnel and you focus on really what's in front of you. Some research shows that Indian sugarcane farmers, post-harvest, when they had money, compared to pre-harvest, when they were deeply in debt and didn't have money yet, post-harvest, they scored 10 IQ points higher. That's a lot. If I gave you all a test now, and I'm not really going to do this, but if I did, and then kept you up all night, tomorrow morning you would score 12 to 13 points lower. So it's almost a full night of sleep from this, right? So
we're going to do that afterwards.
Sorry to give it away. So being poor drains cognitive bandwidth, fluid intelligence, executive function, self-control. So what we can do is use technologies to help people make better decisions for themselves. One example is in the context of modern contraception. Subcutaneous injectables, IUDs, have lots of advantage over the pill and other contraceptives, but they're not appropriate for everyone because of clinical contraindications, or they're not what people want. They want to get pregnant right away. They're also new, and it's hard to understand if that's the right choice for a person. It's hard for a community health worker who typically herself is poor and herself has a tough life to give good counseling. So we've developed a tablet-based app to encode the right kinds of guidance to help people make better decisions, and we're going to pilot it in Cameroon. In Bangladesh, we're helping union social workers they administer several different social transfer programs, overwhelming information, so we're helping them with also a tablet to develop, to make better choices in their guidance. And then one example on the last one, and this is a technology called a comic book, which is still a technology, I think, in some ways for many people. We're using comic books and YouTube videos to bring out growth mindset, which is this idea that students might not do well in school because they think they're just stuck. We did this in Peru. It really worked. For a 2-hour intervention, got a 0.1 standard deviation increase in test scores, 20 cents per kid, 3 or 4 months of learning very quickly. We're using YouTube videos and comic books to try it out in Indonesia and South Africa. So I guess our perspective is that technology can be very powerful but especially if guided by behavioral science that helps people use it appropriately and encodes messages that helps them make better decisions for their own, to improve their own lives.
And I think that's probably a universal takeaway, right, is that technology can be quite beneficial, but it's the context in which it's delivered that determines whether it's beneficial. And I suppose one other takeaway thus far also is that, for all the talk about the good that technology can do in the world, the Anns and the Tamaikas of the world are, still relatively rare. Where we have a number of commercial entities at scale, and there's not enough resources going into deploying technology for social good for things that might not yet be commercial. And I think that's if you're a philanthropist sitting in the audience, I think that's one thing to think about. The other thing to think about is what we need to turn to now, which is this question of risks. And for too long at conferences around development or conferences around philanthropy, we've talked about tech for social good as if it were a unidimensional thing, like that all you had to do was think like, I'm deploying this technology for this social purpose, so it has to be good. And I think the last few years have been humbling in that regard. And the question of trust, how do we trust the values that are embedded in technology is sort of front and center. Simon, when we talked, you were reflecting on this trajectory. and this moment that we find ourselves in as a society. I wonder if you might reflect on that. And also, I was really fascinated by this Gen Arm 2Z initiative that you guys launched, which is on that theme too. If you might comment on that.
Yeah, well, that kind of builds on what Varun was saying about understanding human behaviour. So we've been doing some work with a cyber psychologist named Dr. Mary Aiken, who has been studying people's relationships with technology, particularly some of the threats that young people are exposed to online. And one of the observations she made, that again is one of those moments where you go, of course, is that the technology is changing so fast. It changes faster than traditional study methods around human behaviour can keep up. So just by the time you finish the study, it's the next thing that's moved on. And when you couple that with thinking about how, as a parent, you raise a child, your job as a parent is to make sure your child understands the risks of the world that they're going out into. A lot of the risks they're being exposed to online didn't exist when we, as now parents, were growing up. So how do you prepare your child for that? I like to think of myself as fairly tech savvy and kind of on top of what's going on in the world of tech. But I watch my son on his computer and think, hang on a minute, what is that? It's really quite scary. So, as scary as it is, that technology is going to keep moving, and I don't think any of us can stop that. But, when we look at, the glory that technology has delivered to date, and we think about this world of data and analysing it and what AI can do, the efficiencies that can bring, there are bound to be some unintended consequences from that. In the same way as smartphone addiction, computer gaming addiction, cyber crime. Nobody thought about that when they thought, hang on a minute, wouldn't it be a good idea if we connect like everything on the planet? Yeah, it is, but you've really got to think it through. So our view was, before we kind of launch into this world of AI and big data, we should take a moment to reflect on what has happened so far and think about how what kind of relationships we all should have with technology going forwards, and particularly what kind of relationships young people should have who are fairly blasé about the risks. When I look at my own kids, again, scary moment as a parent. So we're just trying to raise awareness of that, and that's what our program about Gen Arm 2Z is about. It's about getting some young people to talk about how they use technology, and trying to broaden the discussion about this issue, because as technologists, we're going to deliver it. And I don't think we can just absolve ourselves of any of those side effects.
Mm-hmm. And part of the idea there is that it's not just the technologists who should be having these conversations about values, that it's society at large that should be having this conversation.
Absolutely. I mean, technology is delivered to us from tech companies, but as consumers, we get the opportunity to vote with our wallets, and collectively we can have a voice about what is acceptable, what isn't acceptable. The whole debate around use of data over the last month or so has been really quite illuminating, and actually I think in a lot of ways helpful, because the amount of data that's about to get sampled, whether it's about us as individuals or the environment we're in, that's about to go up exponentially. Now's a really good time to be thinking about who gets the data, what can they use it for, who owns it. Really quite fundamental questions that, frankly, we've been brushing under the carpet because there hasn't been any downside. All these services are free.
Right.
Turns out they're not.
Right. And to that end, Tamika, when you think about blockchain, you've laid out, an incredible picture of its benefits and upsides. I personally worry about, from the perspective of privacy, but from the perspective of the European concept of the right to be forgotten, with people that will have records that they don't want there. What do you feel like? Are there sectors that should not adopt blockchain, and are there risks that you're worried about?
Well, it certainly is not a solution for every problem, and it's critical before any organization decides that they're going to migrate a system onto a blockchain-based platform, that they think hard about those long-term design implications. This is a technology with a unique ability to codify trust. And to go back to your earlier question, trust is absolutely fundamental, because every interaction that we have, every instance of human cooperation is ultimately predicated on trust. And if we lose that, and if we lose our faith in the facts that our institutions are responsible for codifying, our ability to do great things as a species erodes pretty rapidly. And so in this case, I think there are some benefits and there's some potential drawbacks. On the upside, this is a new vehicle for establishing the validity and the authenticity of information in a way that is more efficient and arguably more effective than anything we've been able to do previously. And that's very powerful, and we should take advantage of that. On the other side, though, and this is not insignificant, we are making design decisions right now that are going to be with us for a very long time. And the lesson of the last couple of months should be that we should not make those design decisions lightly. Next week, with the help of the Rockefeller Foundation, we're bringing together a sitting prime minister, the heads of many blockchain companies, and an array of policymakers at the Rockefeller Foundation's Bellagio Center to start thinking through the grand strategy around the deployment of blockchain for public problem solving. But we need to have that conversation now because we're at an inflection point. And if we miss the boat, we're going to be in a pretty bad place quickly.
What do you think are the kind of safeguards that are necessary?
The short answer is we need to take advantage of the technology's ability to keep information that should be private, and provide transparency where we want transparency, and do that very strategically and deliberately. We are entering a world where AI is going to be pretty ubiquitous. All of the models that we have had for AI for the last 20 years have been dependent on centralized data storage and centralized data structures. Unfortunately, those models can lead to some pretty scary places pretty quickly. And one of the potential promises of blockchain is that eventually you and I will be able to have our own data wallets. We'll be able to provide access or revoke access to our information if we do it right. And again, there's a question of whether we're going to do it right. But that should give a lot more people a lot more say in how these new technologies are deployed and democratize the potential of some of these new tools in a way that will be very challenging if we stick with existing models.
I'm gonna come back to that. I want to go to Anne. And when you talked about the amount of data that's being generated every second, it is both awe-inspiring. It is mind-boggling. Going back to what Simon was saying about the role of data, and what it can open up and what risks it also creates, and who owns the data and who monetizes the data. When you think about the data you're dealing with, it allows you to do great things, but if it ends up in the wrong hands, it could create harm. What safeguards do you generally try to build into your own work around those topics?
Yeah, so geospatial data, in particular raster-based imagery data, is not big data. It's fat, it's obese, it's as big as it gets. And
obese data, you heard it here first, folks.
And managing that data is no small problem. But when building large repositories or registries of connected data in cloud environment, and protecting that data from in the imaging world, and we've been imaging the Earth for a very long time, and it started really in earnest in 1952 with a program called Keyhole, run by the National Reconnaissance Office and the CIA of the United States. We have always been worried about bad actors. That's the #1 threat of imaging data taken from satellites and from aircraft. And that threat doesn't go away. It doesn't go away with open data. In many ways, it gets bigger. But it is incumbent upon technology platform providers to put in place tools to know your customer. And at the Radiant Earth program, we're certainly doing that, know your customer tools. We're actually bundling that. We've just kicked off a project. I was talking to Tamika about it today. To bundle know your customer tools with blockchain. To try to protect that. We have an ulterior motive in that There are some big buyers for commercial satellite imagery in the global development market. They're the Gates Foundation, they're the Omidyar Network, they're the Rockefeller Foundation, there's DFID. These are huge buyers that buy data, that have a license, that say that they can share it with other nonprofits. And generally, they can share it with anybody as long as there's not a commercial use. But they don't, because they're afraid of breaking the license. And they have no way of putting that online and making it discoverable without running the risk of breaking the license. So we're working with them to ingest their data and put KYC tools in place in addition to blockchain to expose this data that's already been paid for by the philanthropic communities to support global development. So I think that's another great use of blockchain. The concerns I have around satellite imagery are around bad actors, and we deal with that, and this community has dealt with it for a long time, around the invasion of privacy. And that actually in the U.S., there's a good bit of case law that settled much of that issue. And in fact, it won't come as any surprise that that case law came out of California for a very famous actress who had a very large ranch about 300 miles south of here. Her ranch was photographed by the state of California at 1-foot resolution for their property mapping taxes, and she sued the state of California and lost because there's no expectation of privacy at that scale. What changes that in a big way is drone imagery, and that actually does keep me up at night because drones now are becoming so ubiquitous, more so outside the U.S. than inside the U.S. The innovation on drones is really happening in sub-Saharan Africa and in India, but you can get 2-centimeter imagery from a drone that is beautiful imagery, and you can identify a face. You can identify a street address. You can identify a mailbox. You can identify a license plate. So I think there's some serious work to be done there. I think the best example of how that's been mitigated at scale is by Google Maps Street View. So if you've gone to Google Maps Street View, you've looked at your yard, if your car is in front of your yard, you'll see that that license plate has been blurted out. It's been anonymized by machine learning, and if by chance your children happen to have been in the front yard, their faces are no longer recognizable. So I think that there are issues there that we can deal with. The final issue related to imaging is really around other sensitive data. And the mapping community has dealt with some of this for a long time, and that is data like archaeological sites and the location of endangered species. We generally, as a society, do not release that information because if we do, it goes away. And so that's been on a need-to-know basis, and generally it's not an open record. What concerns me about the future, just one example, I am sure, I am positive, that in 5 years, some wonderful graduate student at MIT or at Stanford or Berkeley or at the University of Twente or anywhere around the world will be able to use satellite imagery at a 3-meter resolution, which is full and open, and machine learning to identify tribes, forgotten tribes, or uncontacted people. We'll be able to find them. We'll be able to find them with probably a 95% certainty. But should we? You know, should we? And is it a graduate student that we want to have the power to do that?
Yeah.
So I think there are a lot of questions that have yet to be asked.
I agree, and you sort of get a sense from this panel and from this work at large that we're just sort of scratching the surface. That there are a number of really great efforts, like what you're hearing about here. Even just this last example of blurring out images using machine learning, and so you get the sense that of this sort of inchoate set of standards that are forming, but a lot of work that has to get done. I want to ask one more individual question, and then I'm going to ask you a bunch of like group questions to have you interact. Did you want to say something? Oh, okay. So Vern, one of the things we talked about, and that, if we think about how do we encode values in technology, the question that next comes is, whose values? And one of the questions that we talked about last week was this question of paternalism in delivering technology in emerging markets. How do you think about that question, and how do you think about the solutions to that question?
Yeah, that's an important issue for sure. So I guess the way that I think about it is that really what we're fundamentally talking about is smart regulation, right? How do we sort of develop rules to help individuals and improve our collective lives? And I think for that, we need first better facts. I think most of us are not very good at guarding our own privacy, and we need to really understand what motivates people to guard their own privacy. There's a set of things about information, and a lot of us like to bury our head in the sand, honestly, and cognitive dissonance, investments in an identity, strategic reasons. I think we can really understand the human nature and the psychology of that better. And then I think clarifying our values helps with the paternalism question. And here, the world in which I work, behavioral science and public policy, is sometimes, people have concerns that it's, manipulative, it's paternalistic, you're sort of, you're telling these girls to use a contraceptive, you're telling people to save, how do you know that's good for them? And the way I think about that is that, this is really a tool, right? It's like taxation, it's like setting a law, which is sort of it's a harder paternalism. This is just a tool. It can be used for good or for bad. And that's for us to decide. And I think we need to sort of think about what are the criteria and the values that we would use to assess this tool. And I think that's about becoming clear in our values. And I think, in a place like the United States anyway, that's about respecting autonomy, it's about improving welfare, respecting dignity, and it's about self-government, right? So we want to make sure, I think those are values that we more or less agree on, and if we can sort of be conscious of those, we can evaluate whether the tool is being used in a certain way. I think there's room in my world for actual clarification, like a code of ethics on this, I think that if anyone's interested in this, that's something that we'd be interested in exploring, thinking about how we can actually, the various behavioral science nudging teams think about what's the right set of rules to guide, because that doesn't exist just yet. But then can I say one last thing, Paula, which is that I think there's also conflicts of values that are important. And this is because I think technologies are going to have economic consequences. They're going to have an effect on inequality, one way or another. And I think that's a contested value in our society. And I think we need to it's not going to be easy to think about that. In the world I'm in, as you move to digital money, people don't feel as attached to it as they do actual currency. There's something intangible, and so they're just less attached to it, and that's an opportunity for people that want to take it from you legitimately or illegitimately through some kind of payday loan or something to do that. And we may need rules to help people and guard against rising levels of inequality.
Super hard questions to grapple with. I want to ask all of you why you personally come to this conversation. Why do you care about it? And Simon, you mentioned your son. I also have a 2-year-old daughter who sometimes says to me, "Mommy, no phone," which is really humbling. I'll also say, I spent the last 5 years investing in technology-driven startups with a social mission. I bought the technology for good mantra, hook, line, and sinker. And the last few years have been sort of humbling for me in terms of the number of unintended consequences that have come down the pike, which is part of why Pierre and Omidyar Network, we created this Tech and Society Solutions Lab to try to avert some of that. What brings you guys personally to this conversation? Why do you care about it personally?
I'll say in my case, I had for 4 years probably the best job in Washington, and I led a team that operated a lot like a venture fund. And our job was to find the best ideas we could for supporting good governance and civil society around the world, and then deliver the tech, talent, resources, and partners required to make those ideas come to life. And we had a lot of marvelous successes, but we also had a lot of frustration. And in most instances, that frustration originated from the fact that even when you had good leaders who wanted to do the right thing, in too many cases, in too many countries, the underlying systems that they were working with were so broken and opaque and too often corrupt that it was extremely difficult for them to deliver on the legitimate expectations of citizens and stakeholders. And we recognized that we needed new architecture that could break through that old paradigm. The best counterexample to what we saw in many countries was Estonia. And Estonia had developed the world's leading system of e-governance. And when we went and sat down with the Estonians, they said, look, if we were to do this again today, we would build the whole system on blockchain. Because it is transparent, it is efficient, it allows people to own data, it allows people to share data as they want to. It has the attributes you need to deliver infrastructure, digital infrastructure for the 21st century. And we recognized there was immense possibility in that, and now we're working to realize that possibility.
Anyone else want to comment? Personal motivations?
Yeah, at ARM, we've lived through this kind of mobile revolution and feel kind of proud about the contribution that we've made to that. We see the good that it has done, and people that come to work in the company kind of get a kick out of the work that they do, actually changing the way people live their lives and the benefits from it. As we look at this, what's coming, some of the technologies that we are helping create, we look at that and think this isn't optional. The planet is going to keep on getting more and more populated. Urbanization causes a great deal of stress on infrastructure. A growing middle class places a great deal of stress on the planet's ability to feed us all. And technology can go a long way to help address these issues, along with aging populations and chronic health disease, all these things. Now, so we see an opportunity around this, which is going to be good for our business. We see that as good for our broader partnership. But it won't get delivered unless people trust the technology. And you won't get the trust in the technology unless you can address some of the security issues. And you won't get any of that unless you can address some of the ethics issues. So these are big, hard problems which we see as needing to be solved to expand what will ultimately be, our business and the tech sector as a whole. So, we're interested in it kind of selfishly, but we're also interested in it because it's these kind of problems that draw people to come and work in our company.
And I should say I find that remarkable because I think there are a number of companies that are addressing this as sort of a defensive PR exercise as opposed to a proactive, this is in our business interest and it's in our talent interest and whatnot. And it would be interesting to think about, like, what is the shift that's required to get to that mindset across the industry. But Anne, it sounded like you wanted to say something.
Yeah, so I've been a remote sensing scientist for 34 years now, and I've had the pleasure and the pain of working on some fabulous projects, to being the first to map the Greenland ice sheet, to look for evidence of climate change with lasers, to mapping the country of Papua New Guinea, maybe the most difficult country on the face of the earth to map, to finding the FARC in the Amazon rainforest, to responding to the World Trade Center events of 9/11 and flying that site 3 times a day for 21 days, and to mapping the coral reefs of Hawaii. And I have never been more positive about the power of remote sensing technology and geospatial technologies to help the global development community in particular. This is a new community to me. I know a lot about mapping. I know a lot about technology. I know very little about the world that you live in. I've only been in it for just north of 2 years. It's a very fragmented market. There are a lot of players. with a lot of common denominators. And with the fusion of technologies like cloud computing and the revolution in Earth observations and remote sensing and blockchain technology and machine learning, it's inspirational. I only wish I was 20 years younger to be there to continue to drive this, because we're going to see radical change, I think, in what we can map and monitor and be a part of a solution to support other organizations that carry this information into the field. And, you know, I was inspired the first day that I was treed by an alligator in a swamp when I was 21 years old on my 21st birthday. And I think I'm more inspired today, many, many years later.
That sounds like a very interesting story.
It was a good story.
So this is, you know, we're talking about a diffuse number of technologies and like a mind-blowing number of use cases. Is there anything that's keeping you up at night that that you think the folks in the room are not aware of? Or what are the biggest things that we're not talking about that we should be talking about?
I think that some of the ethics issues that Varun mentioned are things that people don't want to talk about. Mm-hmm. People, and we see this from surveys we run, people are worried about computers making decisions and not understanding how computers are going to make decisions. And I think if the world of tech is left to its own devices, that is what's going to happen. But these ethics issues, ultimately somebody has to make a call about what is ethically good and what is ethically bad. The medical industry seems to have kind of lived through that in quite a positive way. There are a whole load of rules surrounding what you can and can't do in a lab that people, generally, I hope, abide to. And as a public, we kind of accept. In the world of tech, there are going to be similar issues. Self-driving cars are being developed all around us here. They're going to have accidents, right? While there are humans involved, there are going to be accidents. While there is weird weather happening, there are going to be accidents. How the car in the moment makes the decision, somebody's going to code that, and actually understanding how humans make those decisions in the moment, just not understood. So those things, these are really hard problems. And people, ultimately, I think governments are going to have to legislate about what is good and bad. And that's something that I think a lot of people, generally government reputation is well earned, want to steer away from having somebody tell us what is ethically good and bad in the field of technology. But someone's got to make that call. But
it's interesting that you use the example of self-driving cars. I mean, I think that's one of the clearest examples of where most reasonable people would say, oh yes, like there's probably a need for a regulatory regime there. But broadly, are you optimistic that technologists will be open to the kind of self-regulation that you're talking about in the medical industry, right? So the medical industry has licensing, it has review boards and whatnot. Do you feel do you think it's possible to have a shift in the way technologists think about themselves and the sort of general libertarian tendencies in technology? Like, do you think we will get there?
I think ultimately we're going to have to. And again, the events of the last couple of weeks around data, I've said this a number of times at conferences, look, unless we regulate ourselves, we're going to wake up one day and find somebody else regulates us. And this might be the moment when that kind of comes home to roost. So I think the industry is going to have to get its head around this.
The other thing that I would add, at least as it relates to blockchain technology, is our existing systems have all sorts of problems, but they're pretty human systems. And that means that when we make mistakes, there are at least human mechanisms available to redress those mistakes. Increasingly with blockchain technology, you're seeing the emergence of smart contracts that are entirely automated processes. And because the information that goes into the system is locked into the system, it's going to be very difficult to undo mistakes. We're going to have to get very creative in terms of how we deal with dispute resolution. We're going to have to prepare for a world in which we are experiencing the merger of technical code and legal code in ways that those things have never merged before. And again, we are right now I think, looking at 19th century institutions that are using 20th century technology to address 21st century challenges and failing pretty miserably. And we're going to have to dramatically accelerate the capability of our institutions to address these issues if we don't want to end up, again, in a pretty concerning place.
Yeah, please.
I would just come back to inequality, which I think we should spend a lot of more, a lot of people do think about it, talk about it, but I think it's important in this context as well. I'm not sure what to make of all of the prognoses, but if they're anywhere near accurate, a number of jobs will be automated out of existence in the next few decades. And what does that mean for the people who are out of work? Do we need a universal basic income? Who owns the new technologies and how is that shared across society? And then just being out of work is a sort of social malaise. Like, what does that mean for a person's identity and their sense of purpose in life? I think these are important questions. And I think that we need to think about how we're going to address this kind of deep issue of the fact that we don't quite agree on inequality and what we can do about it.
Mm-hmm. And interesting because different societies think about inequality differently. To the question of whose values, and all the conversations about data dividends and whatnot are also quite fascinating, culturally specific solutions to those types of problems, but really fascinating ones. So we just have a few minutes left. This is a room presumably full of really dedicated, optimistic, activists, do-gooders, philanthropists. And I think a type of conversation that's so broad and so far-ranging can be both helpful and daunting. So let's try to bring it back to home in terms of like what you see are the biggest needs for philanthropists. Like how, if philanthropists wanted to get involved in shaping the values of technology that they're getting developed, what are their biggest opportunities? What would be your call to action for them?
Well, I think it would be to look for those projects that are trying to tackle with the most complex problems, because they're not going to get solved quickly. And most people who are trying to, run a business that produces better numbers every 90 days are going to focus on the tactical short term. So, the role of philanthropy, I think, can be to look far out, to think about the long-term horizon, and help sponsor projects which aren't going to generate cash in the short term or maybe ever, but may answer some of these really hard questions that we're facing.
So I had mentioned this possibility of a code of ethics. I think there's room for a sort of trusted convening organization to bring a variety of players, governments, universities across the world together to think about the right way to use technology. And, in our space, sort of, with respect to behavioral science, but even more broadly. But I would also just say it's important to keep doing what you're doing, right? I mean, we're talking about the complications of new technology, but one really basic principle is do as much good as you can, and that's hard to live up to. And we need to keep trying to live up to that and bring access to people who are currently, marginalized.
And on the codes of ethics, there's a number of burgeoning efforts around that. Some are data codes of ethics and some are AI codes of ethics and whatnot. I think there is a larger opportunity also for philanthropists to help scale those into practice because it's right now a very fractured field. So I think that's one very concrete opportunity. Other ideas or suggestions?
Just building on your point and Simon's point, Silicon Valley has gotten very good at building billion-dollar or multi-billion-dollar technology companies. We have huge market failures, however, when it comes to the small work that has to be done to prove pilots and the big work that has to be done to design systems and sectors and fields. And I think those are two gaps that philanthropy can really help to address. In some of the work that we did back at the State Department on internet freedom, I was fond of saying that these technologies, like nuclear power, can be used to light up a city or destroy it. Steel can be used to build hospitals or machetes. These technologies are neutral, but we're not. And we have an opportunity both in small-scale pilots and in big-scale system-level thinking to put our values to work in a way that, frankly, hasn't happened enough as we've focused on growing billion-dollar companies.
Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I guess, you know, from the standpoint of Earth imaging and geospatial technology, one of the things I see is the philanthropic market is exceptionally fragmented. Not only for those organizations that are doing the work themselves, but for their grantees. And there doesn't appear to be a lot of learning in the community. One of the things we're trying to do is create that connective tissue for the grantees and putting out thought leadership pieces and best use cases and things of that nature. But what I'm also starting to see is there may be the need for, if you will, a buyer's club, where I actually think the global development and humanitarian response community is maybe the 4th largest market of satellite imagery globally. No one would have guessed that. The first is the intelligence communities across the globe, primarily the EU and the US. They are the anchor tenants for 2 commercial companies that would be bankrupt without them. They get $350 to $400 million a year, whether they deliver 1 image or 1 million images. That's followed closely by agriculture, ConAgra, and a whole host of other large global agricultural players. Third, 4th, is the global development and humanitarian community that I don't think you ever knew you were that important. And I don't think you're leveraging your buying power. I think you have a lot more buying power. And if there were some way to coalesce the organizations like DFID, like the World Bank, like Omidyar Network, like the Gates Foundation and others, I think we could make your money go a lot farther, a lot faster, to drive and create information that help relieve some of the world's greatest suffering.
Thank you. So this topic can be daunting, but I want to end on a note of encouragement, which is to say we've been here before. You know, there have been people that have been calling tech big tobacco. I think a more apt analogy is the automobile industry. And, you know, automobiles have done amazing things in the world. And there was a distinct movement funded by philanthropy to help automobiles become safe, to develop safety standards, to develop regulations to make sure that these safety standards were adopted. And now we see automobile companies competing on safety. And we're about to see another regime in automobiles around electric automobiles and self-driving cars. The technology and industries progress often with these very clear interventions. We have also seen it in tech. You know, 20 years ago, it was not par for the course for an engineer to be able to red light a product based on security concerns. But a group of, you know, very clear concerned individuals and technologists came together to develop standards around security and norms such that now it is par for the course to have a red light on a product development based on security concerns. So I'm very optimistic that this crisis that we're in right now is a major opportunity and an inflection point in which the efforts of all of us in the room can really help determine not just how these companies are run, but how technology that is going to be so central to all of our lives is going to affect positively the lives of our children and grandchildren down the line. So I want to thank you all for staying with us for this dinner, and a thank you to all of the panelists for the rich comments. And just a quick note that that we're starting tomorrow, I believe, at 7 in the morning. Is that correct? So bright and early. We look forward to another rich day of conversation, and thank you again to all of the panelists.